At the outset of the Battle of San Antonio, the coalition forces, including their artillery forces such as these Venezuelan Otto Melara M56 howitzers, which were a lighter caliber of artillery at 105 millimeters, although they could have a very high sustained rate of fire. They were easy to set up and also easier to move. These howitzers of the Venezuelan 13th Infantry Brigade supported their operations throughout the south of the city for the most part, as they were already busy clearing flanks en route to their major objectives. One of their major objectives being the Brooks Air Force Base, or former Air Force Base, now turned into a consortium of technology companies and defense contracting firms that all work through a public-private partnership as part of the regime's defense industrial base, which made them a major target of the coalition, and the Venezuelans had been entrusted with annihilating this installation, which they were already carrying out as multiple firing of their 105mm artillery howitzers were already laying waste not only to the forces that were in the way of their maneuver elements already busy clearing the flanks as they were hitting whole neighborhoods with massed 105mm fires, which the 105mm, despite being smaller in the artillery calibers, could still be a very destructive weapon if, again, either fired en masse on a single target area or if fire missions were conducted where sustained rates of fire were also poured down on the same target area, whether by one or more howitzers and the like. As the FDC forces also had the added benefit with, despite not having direct access to the Sino-Russian AI real-time battlefield data processing system, they at least had access to the Russian liaison special troops that worked within the headquarters of Headquarters Battalion of the entire 2nd Combined Arms Army, who relayed all of the AI real-time data through radio, which was even translated by the AI into the different languages of the coalition through radio communications automatically, to these forces and their FDC forces getting pre-prepared strike packages passed down through radio instead of through combat data link, as it made them almost as fast as the actual Russian and Chinese and some of the other forces that at least had the basic hardware that they could be grafted into their systems, such as the Iranians and Pakistanis. These forces were still made extremely effective, as the Venezuelans and especially Serbian forces were very heavily armed forces, but with the added benefits of Russian guidance through the real-time AI battlefield data processing network, they were made extremely destructive forces out of the benefits of this system. As the Serbian forces fired their Nora B self-propelled howitzers, as the towing vehicle and gun carriage were all one unit. This was a self-propelled 152mm howitzer, as there was also the Nora B-52, which was the 155 version. This was the 152 version. The Serbian artillery forces not only assisted their mechanized infantry and armored forces with annihilating armed reactionary civilian elements, as the Serbs had been called in as reinforcements to assist the Russian headquarters company over the entire 39th Engineering Brigade, or regiment rather, that was under attack by almost several hundred armed reactionary civilians, of which most were intercepted and also hit by the Serbian howitzer-based artillery, 152mm, as well as being attacked, causing the few survivors to flee along I-35, where a Serbian armored battalion from the Serbian Army's 1st Brigade was mobilized and sent into the area to secure this segment of I-35, as again, I-35 was a critical node and the whole reason why San Antonio needed to be secured in such a rapid form was so that the Group Armies 7 through 13 could seamlessly move through this area, as the external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 7 through 13 needed to be able to move through this very first node. This was the very first major node through which they had to move, and they did not want to have to stop to engage enemy forces. They wanted to continue moving all the way as deep and as fast inland as they could get according to their original invasion plans. Therefore, the pressure upon the Russians, the allies, such as the Venezuelans, even the Nicaraguans and the Serbian forces, even the Chinese owned PLAAF, was immense. They had to perform, and they had to perform well. As the Nicaraguans had heart, and they wanted to thank the Russians for their many decades of support, even back since the Soviet times, all the way into modern times, they had scraped together from their actual military 3 combat battalions, but the battalions were sorely lacking in tactical training and had to go through remedial small unit tactical training provided by the Russians, as well as also they had to go through driver training for their MRAPs that were gifted by the Chinese. The Chinese had gifted these Nicaraguan forces with the VP-3 MRAPs, as well as also crew serve weapons, as did the Russians, and also small arms by the Russians and Chinese, and anti-armor capabilities, as the Nicaraguan forces didn't really have to be trained to utilize RPG-7s or the Chinese Type 69 RPGs. They were adequate in that regard, as they already knew how to operate Chinese and Russian crew serve weaponry as well. All they needed to do was the remedial tactical training, and the driver training for the MRAPs could be achieved in short order, as the Chinese and Russians both contemplated equipping these forces with heavier, more complicated weapons, but the time to train these forces before the invasion's start date was lacking. There was no time to do it, so the Chinese had to give them the most simple weapons that they could utilize, and these effectively were gifted to them as a gift to the Nicaraguan nation and to their military for lending forces to this invasion, even though it was the Nicaraguans also trying to thank the Russians for their many years of support. The Venezuelan forces were very well armed, other than their lacking in AI, ISR, and combat data link technologies. With the radio guidance and steady communications from the Russians, they were able to perform far more adequately than they would have alone, as these forces became exceedingly effective throughout the entire battlefield as they received precision surgical artillery support from their own artillery forces, which suddenly became extremely professional due to the AI strike packages already created for their FTC forces and passed down to the gun lines and fired, such as on the CCP regime property, as they had sandbag emplacements for their howitzers. These Otto Malara M56 howitzers were extremely light, extremely easy to set up, and could have for a short time, a high sustained rate of fire, as a quick gun crew could fire 8 rounds a minute. And although the gun crew had to be ever mindful not to abuse this because it could warp the barrel and cause deadly accidents, these high sustained rates of fire made these howitzers relatively extremely destructive, as they could lay down enormous amounts of shells, and also with concentrated fire from entire batteries firing on the same area, they could level entire portions of cities and neighborhoods. As this AMX-13 light tank, a French-made design, was an archaic design of light tank, but still effective, as many nations still utilized this weapon, as it had been upgunned to a 90mm main gun, as the Venezuelans had the AMX-13/90 for the 90mm main gun, as the original version came with a 75mm main gun. This 90mm weapon, firing either HE or fragmentation shells, as well as some other types of ammunition, could be very destructive as an assault gun against enemy positions, and could wipe out large groupings of infantry or even other vehicles and light bunkers at a time, as this company of light tanks, of AMX-13s, was part of a mechanized infantry battalion, as these mechanized infantry battalions each had a company of AMX-13 light tanks within them, as well as 6 companies of mechanized infantry who utilized their BTR-80As, which were their IFV versions with remote control 30mm autocannon turret, as well as also they used their BTR-80Ss, which were their APC versions of the vehicles, which had a 14.5mm heavy machine gun, which was a step up from the either American 50 cal or Russian and Chinese equivalent, which was the 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, which was already extremely devastating, but the 14.5 was in a league of its own, and they equipped the APCs of these BTR-80Ss along with the 7.62 by 54mm coax that came with it. However, the IFV version simply just had the autocannon, and it was remote controlled. As they had taken fire from a window in this building as the vehicles were further back in their procession, as this vehicle was scanning its 180-degree sector of fire at the front of the procession, it fired a 30mm round into this building, which blasted a gargantuan hole through multiple walls and blew out the floor and collapsed the ceiling also, with the follow-up vehicle who, again, they would have staggered weapons facing this way, this way, this way. The follow-up vehicle sprayed 14.5mm rounds through the building, which shredded also through multiple walls. These were very destructive weapons and carried the dismounts into battle as so. They were again supported in each and every battalion, not only by their own BTR vehicles, which carried the dismounted combat forces, but again, they had their AMX-13 light tanks, one company per battalion, which were very destructive additions to each battalion as a fire support weapon, an assault gun weapon. And of course, they had their own artillery within their brigade, which was lighter artillery, but still could be very destructive, especially with the Russian guidance utilizing the data from the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as the AI even translated over radio into Spanish when all the directions of the strike packages were being passed down to the allies from the Russians. The Serbian forces firing their heavy 152mm Nora B howitzers as the 5.2 version of the Nora B. The Nora B-52 was effectively the 155 version. As mentioned, the gun carriage and the towing vehicle were one unit. This was a self-propelled weapon. They would be entrusted not only firing in support of their armored forces and mechanized infantry against armed reactionary civilian elements right away, but also these batteries, comprising the battalion of these Nora B systems, would be firing at American targets in a major battle occurring right away against the 81st Stryker Brigade combat team. The simple assortment of various artillery types, which even included the thermobaric artillery of the TOS-1A battalion within the 2nd NBCR Protection Regiment, as again, in the Russian army, the NBCR forces are they who operate the thermobaric artillery. Many people don't know that, but that's the way it works. The thermobaric weapons have shorter ranges than traditional rocket artillery, such as the BM-21 Grads, but the Serbs also had a rocket artillery battalion within their 1st Army Brigade, which was their Morava rockets, which had a slightly different looking towing vehicle. It was a truck, but had a flatter nose and also had 122mm rocket pods. And the Serb rocket artillery, as well as the Serbian howitzer-based artillery and the Russian howitzer-based artillery, would all be firing en masse at the installation. The purpose behind the American installation was effectively that as a training installation where major units would rotate through these training grounds known as Camp Bullis, there effectively were now the forces of the 81st Stryker Brigade combat team, which was actually part of the Texas National Guard's 36th ID, that had been brought in from Washington and mobilized, and now were conducting training, but were also issued live ammo as they were anticipating receiving orders to guard local power plants, the international airport even, as well as bolstering security, possibly at some of the air bases like Lackland, including the Lackland Annex, which was miles away from the main installation, as well as also Randolph Air Base, and of course the Army base known as Fort Sam Houston, which actually was also the headquarters of U.S. Army North and U.S. Army South. U.S. Army North being the CONUS, or Continental United States, and U.S. Army South being Central and South America. As these forces had their headquarters establishments on this installation, it was also the home of medical training forces and the 32nd Medical Brigade, as this was a facility, an installation that had the very best burn center in the entire U.S. military, as also the Army hospital there was affiliated in many training activities, and there was also medical training sites on Camp Bullis as well. While Camp Bullis wasn't supposed to have any permanent party or any permanent units present, there was a frequent unit visitor to the installation, which was a reserve unit, the 549th Military Intelligence Battalion, which would do frequent training in this area, and was part of the 505th Reserve Military Intelligence Brigade, which was out of Fort Sam Houston when mobilized. As America was mobilizing all its reserve and guard forces, again, although being slow to do so, it was just getting started on this by the time the invasion had kicked off, and now that it had kicked off, there were 4 companies present. Not the whole battalion mobilized yet, but there were 4 companies, which are these triangles here. Each of these combined is 4 companies. These forces effectively were part of the 549th Military Intelligence Battalion out of the 505th Military Intelligence Brigade of the Army Reserves, and they were being mobilized to assist along with the headquarters of Headquarters Company of the entire 81st Stryker Brigade combat team. There was also the Combat Engineer Battalion, which was more like a Special Troops Battalion in the 81st Stryker Brigade combat team. The Combat Engineer Battalion effectively had 2 companies of engineers, but they had a signals company and a military intelligence company. Now, as the headquarters of Headquarters Company over the 81st Stryker was in the north of the area, setting up near the Combat Air Landing Strip, as this was a state-of-the-art training center, as it's been said, because it has a lot of different training facilities, whether based inside of buildings, such as the simulators for convoy operations and rollover simulators and other simulators. They also have drop zones for paratroopers. They have a Combat Air Landing Strip that could accommodate up to 7 total C-130s at a time, which made this of the utmost interest and importance to the coalition forces, as again, being that San Antonio was such a large city, a heavily populated city, there needed to be multiple megafobs, especially those with runways. Even the Brooks Army, or even the Brooks Air Force Base, rather, had a triangular shape runway system within it, but now that it was a closed-down air base, it was part of America's very small but existent defense industrial scientific base, because there were high technology companies and a consortium of other defense contractors in this location, which made it a primary target for the Russian forces who would fire artillery fire missions into the site, as well as the Venezuelan forces who were entrusted with actually destroying the site, as well as capturing it, as it could be also used as a fob due to, again, its triangular-shaped runway that was present, after first annihilating all armed reactionary civilian resistance. It needs to be understood at all times that the American civilian population was relatively coddled and soft, and most were not ready for high-intensity warfare, total absolute destruction. Most have never experienced anything even remotely like this, and most couldn't fathom the level of destruction. And most were in shock when it happened, although there was a cross-section of the population that would rise up and become reactionary armed civilians and be annihilated where they stood. There was equally another cross-section of armed civilians who would be more wise, and they would go into nature, such as those that fled immediately into the government canyon. Some knew about cave complexes, and they would hide out in there, and they would even survive the Russian long-range reconnaissance patrols that would be launched in there by their Spetsnaz forces of the 70th Special Purposes Detachment, or Spetsnaz Battalion, essentially, as they would come in with their attack helo gunships, use their ISR quadcopters to map the entire battlefield in real time to call in extremely accurate precision artillery strikes, as well as also assist in the airstrikes that would come in from the Chinese exceedingly powerful JH-7 strike aircraft squadrons, of which there were 2 entire strike aircraft squadrons of JH-7s, one J-11 fighter squadron, and one J-16 fighter squadron that would be later armed with air-to-ground munitions as they would come back on their second or third sorties with more and more air-to-ground munitions, as it would be evident that the USAF would by then be destroyed. As now, however, the main strike aircraft were the JH-7s, as they, in 2 squadrons, carried 480,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, which was simply gargantuan. That was a massive amount of air-to-ground ordnance, and they would be destroying enormous targets. As Camp Bullis would be struck by everything from tactical ballistic missiles from Iskander systems, as armed reactionary civilians were even informed and tipped off by others who were conducting ordinary travel when the invasion broke out and could see the missiles flying. They could see the rocket artillery flying off of these CCP properties, along with the Iskander missiles from the general west and southwest of the city. They could also see Venezuelan artillery firing, and of course Serbian rocket and howitzer artillery fires. The TOS-1As, operated by the MBCR protection forces, as that was how the Russians allocated these forces. They had them operated by the MBCR protection forces. They would have their TOS-1A thermobaric artillery. Would also add to the immense destruction between the thermobarics, the air power, 300-millimeter rockets from the Tornado S battalion, also 2 whole battalions of 122-millimeter, which were smaller but could still be highly destructive, fired in concentrated form, along with the Serbian 122-millimeter rockets of their Morava systems, which were their equivalent of the BM-21s. Essentially, there would be 3 whole battalions of rocket artillery with a 4th battalion of 300-millimeter rocket artillery, and then they would have their howitzer battalions between the Russian howitzers, as 2 howitzer battalions from the 385th Guards would be devoted to the Camp Bullis battle, along with the Serbian howitzer battalion from their 1st Army Brigade of their Nora B systems, which were also 152mm, firing from their CCP regime property, as the Venezuelans would shower their target areas in the south of the city in Brooks Air Force Base, or former Air Force Base, rather, with their very high rate of fire and concentrated Otto Melara M56 howitzers, as these 105mm howitzers would again be shelling these areas relentlessly based off of the Russian strike packages passed down to them, as Venezuelan maneuver elements would go in for the literal and proverbial kill. They would go straight for the jugular. As this column of light tanks is moving through this area, this man came out, tried to fire his Glock at this armored vehicle, doing nothing to it, and he got sprayed by the coax machine gun in return. This was an innocent bystander trying to run across the street for cover behind him, but he caught some rounds and simply was mowed down. He got caught in a crossfire. When they were just trying to get this guy for shooting at them. And then these personnel firing rifles are about to be hit by the follow-up vehicle, who has a staggered main gun and coax. Also, they have their turret-based machine guns, their M60s. They could fire a shrapnel round and a fragmentation round right behind these personnel and annihilate them, cut them down by shrapnel, or fire an HE round as an assault gun weapon. These were very effective weapons despite their age. They could still conduct very capable operations in the field, and were thus utilized not just by the Venezuelans, but other militaries. They were an old favorite, as the BTR-80As and 80Ss were even more advanced than the old AMX-13 light tanks, even though these had more firepower at 90mm main weapons. These BTRs were amazingly effective, and they carried in the very well-equipped Venezuelan maneuver ground dismounted forces, as the aircraft had by now achieved air superiority in concert with all of the air defense assets of not only the 2nd Combined Arms Army of Russia in the area, but also the Serbs and Venezuelans, who all had their air defense forces of their SHORAD forces integrated, along with the Chinese fighter support of the J-16 and J-11 squadrons, respectively. The JH-7s were already doing massive airstrikes at the opening of this operation, destroying enormous areas with their payloads, even coming in some instances and assisting the Russian forces who were embattled in certain areas, although the loitering munitions, their machine gun emplacements, were usually enough to fend off any disjointed attacking force, as again, these Americans had no centralized leadership. They were effectively leaderless. They were just armed mobs, effectively. That's why they were called armed civilian clusters. They were just people that were able to mob up together. They noticed they were all armed. They said, hey, let's, go attack this, and they would go and do that. That's exactly what would happen in a situation like this, where there was a communications down situation. People couldn't get in touch with their family or friends whom they normally rely on in such a situation, and would have to mob up together and do what they could if they wanted to be reactionary, which was not wise, but many people chose to do that. Although most Americans were non-combatants at this point, many were still in shock and had not gotten over it because it was only hour one, and all of this mass destruction was occurring everywhere. And people stood there paralyzed with fear, literally, while the reactionary forces would get annihilated everywhere they tried to attack Russian forces, as the coalition had total air superiority and could drop munitions on them. Loitering munitions could strike them. Heavy machine gun and crew-serve weapons could repel them, as well as also missile and other strikes, whether ATGM fired and larger. As the maneuver elements could also be called in as reinforcements, such as this Venezuelan mechanized infantry battalion, to serve two purposes of clearing the flanks and getting these forces off of this Russian logistical battalion, the support battalion of the 950th Rocket Brigade, firing their eye-scanners, as they then would continue into the city and clear more flanks of armed reactionary elements as guided by the liaison forces within the 91st Headquarters Brigade, which was the command and logistical elements over the entire 2nd Combined Arms Army, although there was also a support brigade, but it was deployed in Fort Hood for that battle. There were two major logistical elements, which consisted of the 91st Headquarters Brigade, which was logistics, command, and administrative elements, and the support brigade that was deployed in Fort Hood. As the VVS had 32 helos in the wing of Mi-35Ms that was allocated for this battle, 16, again, were allocated just for Lackland, and the other 16 allocated just for the Camp Bullis battle. And out of the 70th Special Purposes Detachment, or the Spetsnaz Battalion, that was attached to the Russian 2nd Combined Arms Army, and thus under their total command, they would be shuttled in, a company at a time, in both Lackland and also in the battle that was erupting and unfolding in Camp Bullis. They would actually be the very first forces to initiate combat, as they would be flown in, as their helos would come in, guns blazing, weapons blazing, and would annihilate American vehicles that had, of course, crew-serve weapons attached to them. They would annihilate clusters of infantry in terms of the American forces, and they would also annihilate vehicles. They would drop off their very potent Spetsnaz forces. They would fast rope in, they would air assault in, just like this diamond formation right here. You see troops with their AK-74M rifles with optics attached, red dot sights. They got their also image intensifying red dot optics. They've got their grenade barrels under some of the rifles of the men that carried those. They had their PKM general purpose machine gun, RPK-74 light machine gun. This guy's carrying a Coronet ATGM. This guy an RPG-7. These guys are very well armed. Some of them are also FPV drone operators and carry those, and those can cause immense destruction. They can annihilate a main battle tank. They can also annihilate groupings of infantry-type forces as well, as they would also have their full attack helo gunship support throughout the operation. They would also deploy their quadcopter assets, their recon assets, to basically call in precision strikes wherever and whenever needed, as these NBCR troops were there to catch any possible fleeing forces, fleeing the massed artillery, thermobaric artillery, tactical ballistic missile, Chinese cruise missile, and Chinese airstrikes on this entire unit. The objective was to annihilate this unit before it could even react and do anything, as again, the communications down, including military networks, had paralyzed these forces. Their communications, redundant radio comms, are being jammed by the Electronic Warfare Independent Battalion, 53rd here. Were jamming their redundant comms, making it hardly possible whatsoever at all for them to try to organize. Hence, they were being struck by all of this artillery, airstrikes, TOS-1A, thermobarics, 300mm rocket strikes, 122mm rocket strikes, and enormous volumes of 152mm howitzer shells. The airstrikes alone were enormously devastating, but also adding the thermobaric artillery from the TOS-1As with the 300mm and 122mm concentrated strikes. This was immensely destructive. And again, the Spetsnaz would kick it all off, and they would map the area in real time as they were the first troops in, even before the maneuver elements would arrive from the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade, as they would have a mechanized infantry battalion entering from the southwest and west, along with the Combat Engineer Battalion of the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade also entering in the battle, as these were like elite assault infantry type forces by this point from all their experience in the Great Eastern European Proxy War of assaulting heavily fortified areas, and the Armored Battalion, equipped with their very powerful T-72B3M main battle tanks, as well as also their BMPT Terminator anti-tank vehicles in their anti-tank company, as well as also they would have their armored infantry forces, which were basically mechanized infantry companies, of which they had 2 within their armored battalion, as they had 4 tank companies, an anti-tank company, 2 armored infantry, and 1 headquarters and support company. The armored forces, the mechanized infantry forces, and the combat engineering forces would all assault the installation in a hammer and anvil type operation, but mostly they would hardly encounter any resistance, because by the time they'd cleared the flanks en route and arrived, some of these forces would even wisely flee out of the way, as the installation was vastly more important, although they still had to clear the flanks if they were in the way. By the time they would arrive, the Spetsnaz will have already captured the airfield, which was absolutely of vital importance to the coalition forces to build a new FOB around, as they also wanted to capture the international airport, which the combat engineers effectively just rolled in and took. And as they would destroy the entire 81st Stryker Brigade combat team before they could even react, as the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade battalions attacking the installation, which again was a mechanized infantry battalion, an armored battalion, and a combat engineer battalion. These forces would simply overrun anything that even survived the immense artillery and also airstrikes and even the thermobaric strikes, as the installation was massive. In the north was where the headquarters of Headquarters Company was setting up their Tactical Operations Center, or TOC, portable buildings with sensitive equipment, communications equipment, and other equipment within these. This was the TOC itself, and this was the living areas for the commander, the brigadier general, as well as the command elements and administrative elements, as this was the whole HHC, all of their vehicles, their LMTVs, HETs, their fueler, armored recovery vehicle, their Max Pro MRAPs, their up-armored Humvees. This was all the headquarters of Headquarters Company over the whole brigade, and they wanted to set up their command center for all of the operations that the 81st would be conducting in San Antonio, at least until the tandem anti-sat and cyber strikes and the electronic warfare ruined the possibility of this unit being deployed anywhere, as the invasion kicked off before this unit could even leave their bivouac sites, as these forces would have stayed, as they would use this runway for, although it was a training runway, they would have used it for emergency logistical flights as a backup logistical center, as the forces were beginning to set up other forces from the 898th Engineering Battalion, which was part of the 81st Stryker, which should have been a special troops battalion, as they'd only had 2 combat engineer companies, and then they had their military intelligence forces who were setting up their tents at this time and were just getting around to starting to try to fill sandbags, as they wanted their tactical operations center near the headquarters of the entire brigade for obvious reasons. You want your military intelligence to be able to communicate with your headquarters forces over the whole brigade, and you also want Charlie Company, which was the signals company, to be in the loop as well, as signals intelligence was very important. But because of all the electronic warfare assets and the jamming, as well as the tandem anti-sat and cyber strikes, all of these forces were in the dark. And at this point in time, there were elements from other battalions belonging to the entire brigade, these big battalions. They were sending delegations to find out what the hell was going on and what to do about it. And as they arrived, the Russian helos with their first company that they were shuttling in, and their first operation was to capture this airfield. Right as the artillery began to hit in the south, it was hitting a massive area of the base. As this scene would happen a bit later, but the enormous airstrikes that would come in on other parts of the installation would simply be massive and would occur immediately following this first operation to capture the airfield, which was located on flat ground in a valley surrounded by gradually sloping high terrain, as there was like a little draw or spur in here of where the high ground kind of folds together, and over here as well. And there's gradually sloping terrain, as indicated by these lines. It gets higher here, and higher here, even higher up here. As there's, if anyone's seen a photo of the area, it basically has this runway here, and normally there's just a fork in the road right there. As this road leads into the rest of the installation, and this one loops around as well. And there's even a clump of trees at the very end of the runway. This is a very thickly wooded area on the high ground that skirts the three sides of the runway itself. As the high ground was flown over by the 16 Russian attack/transport helos of the Mi-35Ms with their potent Ataka ATGMs, their S-8 80mm rockets on each side of they had 40 on pods on each side of the attack helo, like so. They would have been right there. These were coming in, as this is at a different, showing the helo at a different angle than this. This would have been coming in, firing its 23mm nose cannon and some of their ATGMs, but holding their rocket ammunition for later, as that would be absolutely devastating on vehicles and other types of forces, as the heaviest vehicles they would be encountering in this battle would be the American Stryker vehicles, which the rockets, the S-8s, were easily able to penetrate the armor of those and annihilate them, and as could even the 23mm nose cannon. As the 23mm would also tear up the MRAPs and gun trucks of the Humvees of these headquarters elements, which were administrative and command forces, along with elements, this wasn't even the whole company, but this was elements of Charlie Company that were pulled from their platoons to come out and work on the site. They were putting up the portable buildings, they had their HETs that brought in the portable buildings, they had their LMTVs, they were going to get the tents out and set those up. They had already filled sandbags to surround this area, to fortify it some. Again, different Redcon statuses existed in different installations and places. And even though Camp Bullis did not have really any permanent party, they had forces constantly rotating through, including those that defended the armory where absolutely live ammunition was kept. Yes, Camp Bullis had an actual armory with live munitions and ammunition within it, and it had a rotational security force. And these forces were now going to set up a semi-permanent presence by the airfield. Again, Charlie Company, signals intelligence. You had military intelligence, and then you had the headquarters of headquarters, who was in command over the entire brigade of the 81st Stryker. They would have been up here in the north, just slightly off the map where the runway runs north-south. And the elements of the 898th, the Combat Engineer Battalion marker right here, they only had 2 engineering companies within this battalion, and the other companies were the signals intelligence and military intelligence, who were setting up in this area. So when the helos came over, the Russians, they came 8 at a time on this side, flying in low, hugging the terrain, and as they came up over the hills, their weapons were blazing, as they could track multiple targets like most modern attack helo gunships, and they were firing their 23mm nose cannons and Ataka ATGMs at MRAPs and the tops of Humvees, completely shredding these vehicles. As there was also a serious attack drone that came in as well, a Russian attack drone, firing its Viker 1V ATGMs, which flew into this area here to hit the Delta Company, or the Military Intelligence Company, even a foot patrol that was patrolling the area, as they stepped up security as they were working on building up their tactical operation centers, or their TOCs, for their different companies, as they belonged to the 898th Engineering Battalion, but again, they were more like special troops, and they were setting up their talks to be in close proximity to the brigade command because these forces obviously needed to work together. And as a result, they were all there for the taking as the Russian forces fired at the vehicle-based patrols as J-11s streaked overhead on their combat air patrols, as well as JH-7s flying in, preparing to drop enormous payloads upon their targets. As can be seen here, the airstrikes are about to commence at this point in time. This is when the 1st Spetsnaz Company is initiating the battle at Camp Bullis in the north, as again, there would be 3 companies shuttled in who would spread out along the perimeter to patrol it and map the area in real time with their quadcopter assets, and if anyone tried to escape the bombardments or airstrikes, they would call in precision strikes or deal with it themselves because they didn't anticipate that hardly any people would survive such a massive bombardment. I mean, it would be enormous. All of this different artillery from multiple battalions firing into this area, including the TOS-1A fire, it was simply too much. And especially half a squadron of JH-7s, that was an enormous amount of air-to-ground ordnance. It was highly unlikely that anybody would survive such a massive attack from all of these different forces. And as the Russian forces came in, firing their weapons, destroying patrolling vehicles, even a few were engaged, but the original helo, known as the Mi-24 Hind, had been known as the flying tank. For an attack helo / transport helo, it had actually decent armor, and the small arms were already difficult enough to hit this attack helo with as they moved up and down and maneuvered in the area. It's difficult to hit a moving helicopter, much less moving people at times, so the damage done was very minimal, and they returned fire immediately and annihilated these forces in this wedge formation. As these forces were coming around this higher ground here, they were also being fired at by the 23mm main guns, whose rounds were blasting in this area, cutting these personnel down. The same happened here right away. A 23mm round impacted the ground right here, blew the first 3 away, and the others continued running forward, but then got hit and destroyed by the 23mm fire. This vehicle, this up-armored Humvee, was annihilated by 23mm fire. This was all exceedingly fast. They came in quick, hugging the ground, firing. This was all happening very fast. That needs to be understood at all times, including this serious attack drone firing its Vickers V1 ATGM missiles at the military intelligence forces of Delta Company. This wasn't the whole Delta Company, but these were the forces pulled from it to start building up their talk. They already set up a few tents. They had a HET, they had a LMTV, they had Max Pro MRAP, and a gun truck for security for their lead NCOs who were supervising the construction of their tactical operations center, and it was hit by this attack drone and also by attack helo gunship fire, including these patrols patrolling the area with live ammo, but they also were hit by a Vickers V1 23mm fire. They were gone. All of this was fast and heavy. As these forces continued to fire, they eventually maneuvered in pairs of helos to conduct fast rope operations with their squads after they had laid waste to these areas, including the living areas for the HHC's forces, the command elements and administrative elements over the whole brigade. Many of them were trying to fight and fire from the sandbags at first, and they were right away wiped out by 23mm fire. Blew these sandbags away from them and blew them into pieces. Shrapnel from the 23mm impacts went through this tent and maimed people who would eventually get medical treatment from the Russians, oddly enough, but they would have to surrender first. All these vehicles, these trucks, LMTVs and HETs, fuel truck, armored recovery vehicle, Max Pro MRAP, up-armored Humvee, they were all annihilated. As these forces came in, they had their weapons staggered. 50 cal were mounted to 4 gun trucks. These were the 2 that could be seen. There were 2 more following. By the time they got here, they were hit by 23mm fire as well. This area was a 1.5 mile by half mile area. These weapons absolutely had the range to hit these personnel from all the way on this hillside here as well as over here. There's even better, closer range. They hit this vehicle coming from another battalion element to the south as well. As artillery started to come into the south and began to shower areas to the south with massive destruction as this was going on. As the other maps will be gone over in following videos, there will be 3 parts to the Battle of Camp Bullis. It was a large operation, as it began with an air assault operation to capture the airfield by these special operators of the Spetsnaz 70th Special Purposes Detachment. As these helos came in after they saturated the area in 23mm fire, they dropped off by fast rope 2 squads into position who fast roped out of their helos and formed a diamond formation with their helos still overhead, watching the area for them, giving them cover, as they then watched their different fields of fire tactically. As these 2 dropped off 2 more squads, they watched their back tactically, watched these fields of fire, then they dropped off 2 more who then bounded and covered tactically as they stopped receiving fire, and they were really curious as to why that was, because the attack helos had also destroyed this portable building, as there was sensitive equipment and communications equipment in these buildings. This was the actual TOC for the brigade's HHC, and these were their living areas. This was their motor pool by the airfield, by the runway, and this is the road that led into the runway. And as these forces tried to move out, they were cut down by the attack helos even before they moved in and dropped off their squads via fast rope, who bounded and covered. This squad would watch this field of fire, and this squad this field of fire, before they then moved, as this squad would move to cover the back, as all of these vehicles had been destroyed. That has to be understood. All these were destroyed by 23mm fire, including these vehicles of the brigade headquarters. All of them had been destroyed, and some by ATGMs, as this attack helo fired 2 Atakas and blasted this MRAP and this MRAP to total scrap metal. And also, the same thing occurred up here with these 2 MRAPs. 2 Atakas were fired and they destroyed them. This attack helo, this Mi-35M had fired 1 and destroyed this MRAP, but fired 23mm and destroyed this Humvee. And again, they could fire at multiple targets at one time using their 23mm and missile fire, so they could track a target with missiles, and then they could also fire their gun at a different target. So they fired this one, this Ataka ATGM, and blasted this MRAP to pieces, and then these forces were KIA'd as a result. All these forces were KIA'd mostly by the 23mm fire, and some that were in this tent in the very back right here were terribly maimed and would receive medical attention, because after all this occurred and all these forces were annihilated and there was destroyed smoking vehicles everywhere and corpses and body parts thrown around from all the destruction, as ATGMs destroyed these vehicles, and as this truck had a driver in it and tried to take off, they were shredded up by 23mm fire from Charlie Company elements right here that were trying to set up their TOC. It was all for nothing, because all these 23mm rounds shredded up these portable buildings for their signals intelligence forces, destroyed their sandbag emplacements, destroyed all their vehicles, including with ATGMs hitting their strongest vehicles, being their 3 MRAPs and their up-armored Humvee, including with crew-served weapons attached, with ammo. All of this was destroyed, as were their HETs and their LMTVs, including this LMTV that tried to speed off and got shredded up by 23mm fire by these forces. After they had dropped off all their squads, as these 2 squads watched this field of fire tactically, as these 2 helicopters came in to drop them at the end of the runway, they watched these directions. This squad watching this way, they all had interlocking fields of fire tactically. And then these squads, as they bounded and covered towards these areas, these troops had dropped their weapons and officially surrendered. They did not want to get wiped out, because this attack, as it came in, it was very fast and very savage. It needs to be understood that the capture of this runway and the decapitation of the brigade headquarters elements, that's the command and administrative elements of the entire brigade, which was also now getting horribly rocketed and shelled and missiled out of existence to the south, they had been captured. So they wanted the brigadier general alive anyway. He was a high-value individual. They also wanted the command staff alive, even though some opted to fight and were wiped out for it. They would send in some of their squads as the others looked on and watched the security of the area, including these 2 squads watching this area, the squad watching this area, while this squad moved in and then came around to watch this field of fire so that if anyone tried to flee, they could get cut down. So these squads came in to take the prisoners and process them. Effectively, all of this happened within a very short time. This was over before 15 minutes. This was exceedingly fast. All of this action was fast. They fast roped out of their helos quick. All of this was done just under 15 minutes. It was like a 14-minute operation to do all of this, including the bounding and covering. This was a very high-speed, very fast operation. High speed in the military term for something that's elite, and high speed in the literal sense because it was all very fast moving. As these helos came right over the hillsides, they came in everything blazing. They annihilated that. Even this combat drone, this Sirius drone that came in and fired its Vickers V1V missiles and destroyed these forces, including the patrolling forces, along with fire coming from the attack helo gunships. All of this occurred exceedingly fast. Spetsnaz forces came in, they took their prisoners, and they would hold them, and they would even send the maimed and horribly wounded back that were in the tent that got shredded up with 23mm shrapnel from their attack helos. They would send them back to the Russian medical battalion of the 91st Headquarters Brigade that operated a surgical center, as this was the main medical force over the 2nd Combined Arms Army. It had their they had their brigade surgeon, and it had many other surgical personnel and combat medics and more that treated friendly and enemy forces alike when they were POWs, as POW status meant that they had to afford medical treatment to the captured American forces. So as these forces would be airlifted out, the wounded, the rest would be held in this area as these 3 squads right here from 1 platoon would guard the prisoners while the rest would hold down this area and begin to map it out in real time, as well as looking on, because to the south they would see enormous rocket strikes, missile strikes from tactical ballistic missiles. They would see the Chinese aircraft coming in and dropping enormous payloads, and the results of that, as massive clouds of destruction would arise, especially from the Tornado S, as well as the JH-7s and the thermobaric artillery, which would be massive, as the thermobaric rockets would cause also immense destruction. And then, of course, there was the concentrated howitzer-based fire from the Russian howitzers, from their 2S-19 MSTAs, concentrated rocket fire from the Russians and Serbian rocket forces, and, of course, the howitzers of the Serbians firing in support as well. All of this firepower was gargantuan, and it was destroying enormous areas of the installation to the south of this airfield. They wanted to preserve the airfield, so the first company of Spetsnaz that came in captured the airfield, with the follow-up company coming in and being dropped further south, with the third company coming in to assist in cutting off any retreats from the main training area, as it was about to be heavily bombarded. It was about to be hit exceedingly hard by everything from tactical ballistic missiles to rockets to howitzer shells. More to come in the next video installation.